Femi OK. Today the stream team will be bringing you stories from 3 different countries, from Lebanon, from Ethiopia and from the United States. It will be a fast moving show. If you've got comments or questions for our guests, get to it. Jump into the comment section and you too can be part of this discussion. We start in Lebanon. You may remember 6 months ago, a huge blast at the Beirut port. 200 people, more than 200 people were killed, thousands injured. So 6 months on, how is recovery, rebuilding, who's responsible for this disaster? Questions that we asked to citizens from Lebanon, and this is what they told us.
More than 200 victims, thousands of injured individuals and citizens who are all suffering from PTSD, including loved ones, friends, family, who can't even imagine sleeping in Beirut again, and yet no sign of justice. But one thing is for sure, we will never forget, and we are all waiting for justice, and all the victims will forever be alive within the survivors and the Lebanese citizens.
To date, we have reached more than 145,000 people affected by the blast. As we move from relief to recovery, we are refurbishing damaged primary healthcare clinics and providing mental health services by addressing disorders such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Carmen is joining us to explain more about what's been going on in Beirut in the last 6 months. If anything's been going on in Beirut in the last 6 months, Carmen, good to see you. Introduce yourself to our stream audience. Tell them who you are and what you do.
Femi, thank you so much for hosting us and for giving Beirut a space on your show. This is not a local story. This is a global story. It is about citizens that live in the midst of a negligent and corrupt government and that is partisan and sectarian driven. This is a story of survival. This is a story of networks of solidarity that came together and decided that we deserve to live better and we know how to live better and we are able to deliver in terms of people's health and well-being and environment. The explosion was the epitome of what happens to populations. When you leave people who are governing, these are warlords. They don't understand the logic of development. They don't understand the logic of equality. They don't understand the logic of human rights. And they decided to govern at the same time. This is a story of survival. This is a story of multiple people coming together to say, we know how to live better and we are ready to deliver on our promise. So this is what's Lebanon. I mean, I'm talking to you now. I was in the middle of this desk when the explosion happened. And here I am, 6.5 months
later. Yeah. Extraordinary. Carmen, I'm looking here at a headline from Human Rights Watch. Lebanon flawed domestic blast investigation. Just going to scoot up here just to remind people of some of the images that became very familiar to us. August the 4th, 2020. This investigation, what is happening? What have the citizens of Lebanon found out so far?
The problem is that we have realized 30 years later is that the same rulers that make war cannot make peace. Their logic and their expectations and their mode of governance has nothing to do with the 21st century. 21st century, particularly after the COVID pandemic, is about science and math and jobs and equality and women. And these people who are governing us today, they did a war 30 years ago and they decided that they're going to govern within the same logic. They have nothing to offer for our young people, for our parents, for the survivors of the explosion. So,
Carmen, but are you saying then that your politicians, that your judicial system is not capable of finding out who was responsible for the Beirut blast?
There is an extreme distrust in the judicial system. That is not to say that the judicial system is not capable, but that people have major distrust in terms of all of the impunity that happened in the post-Civil War period, in terms of people who got assassinated, explosions that have happened that never got vindicated. There is a major distrust, and there is also a major divide between what young people desire to see in terms of their country, in terms of employment, economy, equality, equal rights, investment, and in terms of what the country has to offer. I mean, nobody in their right mind graduating now would put their money in the banks in Lebanon. There is a
Right.
major rift, and we are stuck in the middle of the past and the old century of what Lebanon represented. And this also connects with colleagues in Iraq, Senegal, Afghanistan. Like what was the governance system in the last 100 years, and what's the governance system for the next future 100 years? And our politicians do not find themselves able to offer solutions for the next 100 years.
Let's talk practically then. You're saying you were sitting in that office 6 months ago. I'm wondering what the rest of Beirut looks like. There's a comment that we got from a citizen who explained what the building work looks like, what the reconstruction looks like. Have a listen to this, come, and then come off the back with your thoughts.
Beirut today is a construction site. It's a city of scaffoldings with a lot of attention, but with very few actions. It's still pretty much a horror scene at night, especially that there are no works done on large-scale structures such as the port or high-rises. It's true that there are no more rubbles on the streets, but you can still feel and see a broken and beaten city. The residents of these areas are going through their trauma on a daily basis. On the street level, a lot of stores are still untouched, a lot of them moved, a lot of them will never reopen.
So, how's the rebuilding going?
Lebanon is held hostage. Survivors of rape say the same thing that everybody in Beirut says. We are living with our oppressors. We see their pictures on TV. They get to go on talk shows. They are wearing suits. Their children study abroad. They get paid for life because when you become a parliamentarian in Lebanon, you get paid for life. We are living with our rapists. We are living as survivors of violence, structural violence, and they continue to be the power brokers in terms of our system, our banking sector, our employment, our jobs. There is garbage on the street. We are living with our assassins, and we have to accept them because they were able to secure a majority in parliament. And that is a story that has to be told.
Carmen, will we ever find out who was responsible for the Beirut blast? Will you ever find out? Will Lebanese
It's
people
not
ever find
important.
out?
It's not important. It's not important the names. What is important is that people in Beirut, like people in every part of the world, deserve to live better. And we know how to live better. There was no reason for explosives to be, you know, placed near schools and hospitals and universities and mosques and churches. There was no reason for that. This is a safety issue and this is a human rights issue. And nobody deserves to live near explosives and scared for the well-being and lives of their children. And that is the fight ahead, is to create systems that are fair and safe for everybody and an inclusive manner for everybody that is on Lebanese soil, not just for Lebanese.
All right, Carmen. It's obvious from this conversation that we had, and to be honest, every conversation we have about Lebanon, it's always about the politicians and always about the politics. Carmen, thank you for helping us today get up to date with what's been happening for the Beirut port investigation. We appreciate you. We move now to Ethiopia, where some journalists are finding it increasingly difficult to report on stories and news inside the country.
The crackdown on Ethiopia's independent press and the jailings of journalists there has already backfired due to its leaving the demand for credible information and news unsatisfied and easily exploitable by irresponsible, unreliable social media sources who, due to a lack of accountability, have been given free rein to disseminate baseless allegations, rumors, and hate speech. And in addition to this, a lack of journalists means a lack of scrutinizing eyes and an environment ripe for those who are behind organized crime or state abuses to thrive unperturbed.
Hello, well, good to see you. Thanks for joining us to help us understand and unpack some of the big stories happening in Ethiopia right now. Will, say hello to our audience, tell them who you are and what you do.
Good evening, Pemi, and thank you. My name is William Davison, and I'm a senior analyst for International Crisis Group for Ethiopia, and also have a history of working as a foreign correspondent based in Addis Ababa.
You are so used to following stories that come out of Ethiopia, reporting on stories from Ethiopia. How would you characterize the relationship between the current administration and journalists right now?
Certainly one that is that's strained. I think. With this new administration came to power in 2018 after sort of 3 years of protests in Ethiopia, and that was sort of seen as sort of springtime in Ethiopia. Lots of promises of democratic reform, and one of the things that people were hoping for is that the sort of previous restrictions on the press that we saw would be eased. So in the past, we've seen sort of jailing of journalists and all sorts of harassment of the press. And there was this hope that this would be a new era. Now, there certainly has been some positive achievements, as with many parts of this transition. Some journalists who were previously exiled returned, some new media sprung up. But really, this has been a troubled transition, as you yourself have covered on this program. And as the politics has got sort of nastier and nastier, and these various sort of power struggles have emerged during this sort of this political opening we've seen, unfortunately, we've also seen something of a regression to these sort of clampdowns on freedom of expression.
Right.
That has resulted in quite a fearful atmosphere for the press, and so something to the return to these sort of to what was experienced over the last decade or so.
So that's good context to understand our conversation right now and understand the difficulty of getting the information and valid information. I want to go back to last summer and talk about an Oromo activist called Hachalu Hundessa, who was a Oromo activist, famous Oromo musician. Since his murder, there have been tensions with President Abiy Ahmed's government, and Oromos. Why is that happening, and where are we today?
The killing of Hachalu, who was primarily a singer, but a singer who sort of sung resistance or liberation songs for the Oromo at times, that was just a huge blow to the Oromo people. There's all sorts of murkiness around his death. People are on trial for it. It's blamed on Oromo rebels, but that isn't really accepted by a large proportion of people in Oromia. Immediately after Hachalu's death, we saw mass protests. They led to violence, and then there was this big crackdown on the Oromo opposition. So it was a sort of double whammy, really, for the Oromo nationalist movement or the Oromo opposition. On the one hand, their hero Hachalu was assassinated, and then subsequently their leaders were also jailed as a result of these violent protests. So the situation has by no means really significantly improved since then. If anything, what was previously a very vigorous Oromo protest movement that really was a major factor in bringing political change in Ethiopia and bringing Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to power in 2018. It's been relatively quiet since July, but now we are seeing stirrings of renewed resistance. There is an ongoing hunger strike about to enter its 4th week by some of those most well-known Oromo political leaders. That has catalyzed some protests in Oromia. So although we see nothing like the disturbances that we saw 5 years ago, 4 years ago, that again, catalyzed political change in Ethiopia, there is thought to be a great deal of resentment brewing up about the jailed leaders, about the assassination, and also about what is seen as the sort of broader betrayal of that Oromo movement, where they felt like they brought this government to power, and then the government did nothing to really recognize their demands. And just one final point, Femi, we have an election coming up in June. And today, after sort of warnings, one of these major Oromo opposition parties formally said that it was not going to participate in the election. So that could also trigger renewed tensions, protests, unrest in the run-up to the election.
Well, I don't do this very often during the stream, but I want to show you my notifications because my extended Ethiopia Twitter family, and I say family in the meaning of being an online family, have taken over my notifications. I only ever get notifications from Ethiopians campaigning, talking about hunger strikes. A few weeks ago, it was about the Tigray conflict. Now it is all about political prisoners. How do you put what I'm seeing, and I know a lot of other journalists who cover Ethiopia are seeing in terms of this campaign, this lobbying, in the context of what is really happening on the ground?
Well, I think as Zacharias was saying, we have this very constrained media environment. In Ethiopia, as I was explaining, there's something of a lapse into repression. I think that leads to, increased intensity in terms of social media activism.
Yeah.
As we all know, Twitter is something of an elite game, but, politics is, to a large degree, about those elite struggles, isn't it? And I think, certainly with the Tigray crisis, I think online activism is playing a major role in terms of trying to get, fragments of information out of Tigray where there is such restrictions on the flow of information and journalism. And then I think, as we've seen in the past, these spaces can also be very useful for Oromo activists in the past, Facebook being a place where protests were organized and information was disseminated. And now we see more of these sort of Twitter-based campaigns, perhaps trying to raise awareness of what is going on in Oromia. So I think, that we do have this problem of a light not really being shone on a lot of Ethiopia's problems. And so these online spaces are a place that people go to try and do that. And obviously that intensifies as political tensions increase. And that is very much the case in Oromo right now with this ongoing hunger strike.
Will Davison, thank you so much for joining us and really unpacking some of the politics and some of the news that's coming out of Ethiopia right now. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We move now to the United States and a very disturbing statistics about healthcare workers. So we all know that COVID-19 has been impacting healthcare workers because they're on the front line, particularly nurses. But the biggest nurses union in America discovered recently from a study that 30% of all COVID-related deaths relating to nurses happen to Filipino nurses. Why would there be this high statistic? Because only just about 4% of nurses in the American system come from the Philippines or have Filipino heritage. This is something that we really wanted to find out, and we asked Alexander Adia to help us.
These deaths are being driven by factors that, for years prior to the pandemic, have consistently failed to be addressed. So this includes things like the history of U.S. colonial dynamics established in the Philippines that led to nurses as exports. In today's world, the disproportionate work in frontline care settings and thus increased exposure to COVID. But then also data systems that prevent us from actually having insight into many health issues faced by Filipinos themselves. So the only way to really move forward here is to address these underlying issues, including the gaps in data that really prevent us from being able to identify when these issues are happening in real time.
It always feels like this is some kind of bizarre medical mystery. Here to help us unpack it is Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you for joining us on the stream. Can you tell our audience who you are and what you do?
Hi, thanks for having me. I am an assistant professor at Brown University, and I'm a co-founder and co-director of a Filipino health initiative at our School of Public Health.
What did you think when you first saw the numbers, statistics of how many Filipino nurses had died from coronavirus?
I mean, it's absolutely devastating. And this is both personal and professional for me. I'm a daughter of a Filipino nurse. My relatives are nurses around the country as well as in other parts of the world. So it's absolutely devastating. I mean, what it really underscores is that the invisibility of Filipino nurses in the U.S. healthcare industry, that we don't hear about the disproportionate number of Filipino nurses that are part of the labor force. Our research is showing that they're on the front lines. They're in the ICUs. They're in the emergency rooms. They're working in nursing homes and caring for some of our most vulnerable populations. But they themselves are vulnerable, and we don't hear about them. They've been here it's not just recently. Filipino nurses have been in the United States for decades. And some of Catherine Zazina Choi's work, she wrote the first book on the history of Filipino nurses here in the United States, we find that Filipino nurses have been here for almost 100 years working in our healthcare system. And so this statistic is hoping to center the contributions that they have made to the U.S. healthcare system to date, and the devastating death tolls, speaks to their vulnerability, speaks to them being on the front lines, and it's about time we recognize their labor.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the report that revealed the statistics about the Filipino nurses, and it's called Sins of Omission, how government failures to track COVID-19 data have led to more than 1,700 healthcare worker deaths and jeopardized public health. Are we still in that same vulnerable situation in the United States?
Yes, definitely. Recent reports are still showing how devastating the toll is on hospital settings. So we're still seeing the numbers of COVID impacting hospital settings, nursing homes, and then so what I really want to point out particularly is that for decades they've been on the front lines working in these spaces, but historically, we don't talk about Filipino nurses in the sense of, when I did a literature review, a lot of the xenophobia that still exists around this population of workers, where a lot of the research, often in nursing journals as well as in public health journals, often more focused on the questioning the quality of care Filipino nurses provide, questioning whether they're taking the jobs away from other nurses in this country, without, again, focusing and bringing context to the U.S. and Philippine colonial history that actually brought them here to the United States. Filipino nurses were recruited to work in hospitals and nursing homes that were particularly located in urban and rural settings where they had huge shortages of labor. And so Filipino nurses were filling in these gaps in caring for some of our most vulnerable and sickest populations. Yet again, and they're doing it now during a time of COVID, but they've also been on the front lines of the HIV crisis and other crises that we have faced in this country. And COVID is bringing to bear the truths around just the sacrifices they have made throughout the years.
Some of our commenters on YouTube are saying that they haven't heard about this statistic of the nurses, and they're really surprised to hear this story on the stream right now. There's something that's really important that I want to do, and not just talk about the problem, but also talk about then what do you do about it. Earlier we spoke to Catherine, and this was her suggestion. Let's have a listen.
There are several things we can do to help the situation. First, we should bring Filipino nurse leaders in the United States to the policy table. Second, we should disaggregate data so that researchers can investigate why this is happening in the 21st century. And third, we should increase the visibility of Filipino nurses in American culture so that Americans have a better understanding and appreciation for the work of Filipino nurses who are risking their lives in order to save us.
In the final minute of our conversation, Jennifer, I just want to do this, which is really important, which is share a tribute gallery to some of the amazing healthcare workers who've been lost in the past year. And as I scroll through these faces, these family members, what do you want us to do with this information? What should we be doing now?
I mean, even seeing these faces too, it's really devastating to see these pictures. Is that we can no longer be invisible. You cannot take Filipino nurses for granted anymore. I do feel that for years and decades, we've taken for granted the labor that they've provided for this country, the sacrifices they've made. And Catherine is exactly right. We need to disaggregate data. So when we think about Asian Americans in health, we often have this stereotype that Asian Americans have much better health outcomes than white Americans. And once you disaggregate the data, it simply isn't true. Filipinos are facing some of the worst health outcomes. And so one of the major findings for our team over at Brown, as well as our, the partnership we have with Catherine Zazina Choi over at Berkeley, is that we're finding this Filipino health paradox, right? Is that Filipinos are disproportionately in the front lines of healthcare, providing care to some of our most vulnerable populations, and are also part of labor unions and are leaders of labor unions.
Jennifer.
So they're not just they're not just advocating for the rights of Filipinos, but now they're also some of the sickest populations in our country. And so that we're really trying to examine that paradox.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
To share an unreported story that we should know more about. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time on the stream.